we have a professed liberal on to talk about his recently acclaimed Nixonland. He wrote a book before this on Goldwater, and now has captured the conservative movement with Richard Nixon. But Perlstein, thank you so much for coming on.
Now it's good to be here.
So, one of the arguments in your book is that Nixon was able to win because of this silent majority that was rejecting some of the crazy liberalism at the time. Do you think it really was that, or was it that Richard Nixon was a better politician than Hubert Humphrey in the 1968 election?
Well, he certainly was. You never want to underestimate Richard Nixon's skills as a politician. But after all, remember that he only got something like 43% of the vote in 1968. And 12% of the vote was harvested by this guy, George Wallace.
From the South.
Yeah, from the South, segregationist Alabama governor, who basically had almost fascist elements to his appeal. Like, he would do things like, he gave a rally at Madison Square Garden and he said, we don't have any riots in Alabama. If people riot, we just shoot them through the head. And then he gets a standing ovation. So if you add up Nixon and Nixon and Wallace's totals, you get a phenomenon that transcends Nixon alone and becomes a block of voters who are basically voting against liberalism and backlash against liberalism. And that's what Kevin Phillips, in a famous book that came out in 1969, called The Emerging Republican Majority. By 1972, he manages to basically bribe George Wallace into running as a Democrat to help divide the Democratic Party. So he gets that kind of backlash vote for himself and gets 61%. But by the same token, Hubert Humphrey did not run a great campaign. Most prominently,
he didn't even have the support of his own president.
He didn't have the support of his own president, as you read in Nixonland.
Yes.
Nixon.
Originally, he wanted Rockefeller.
Seemed to prefer Nelson Rockefeller. Yeah, and Hubert Humphrey didn't really have the courage to distance himself from Lyndon Johnson and the Vietnam War.
Always a futile process, but fun nevertheless. Do you think if Robert F. Kennedy wasn't assassinated and he got the nomination, that Nixon still would have won?
I'm not into that kind of stuff.
Not into that kind of stuff. That's the stuff that gets on television.
I know. I'm a terrible pundit. I don't like predicting the future or counterfactuals. The world is just too rich and contingent and complex than that. And even if Bobby Kennedy won, which Bobby Kennedy? I mean, you read how when he won that famous primary in California in June of 1968, prior to his assassination in '91, he basically ran as a law and order Democrat, picking up on a lot of the same themes that Nixon had. He made some disparaging remarks about blacks too. I mean, he didn't make disparaging remarks.
Well, not during the campaign, but a few years ago, he said they won't even obey the law. Was the point?
That wasn't really a disparaging remark about blacks, but it was one that really spoke to the difficulty a lot of liberals at the time had in integrating people's fear about law and order into their presentation. This was after the Watts riots, this very famous event where thousands of black people in Los Angeles burned down buildings and looted, and the police went on a rampage, and I don't remember the exact death toll, but at least a couple dozen people died. And when he said, when Bobby Kennedy said in Time magazine, you can't expect every Negro to obey the law, which is what they were called then, to a lot of them, the law is the enemy, he was actually making a kind of a reasonable, if impolitic, observation. In a place like Watts, a lot of the police officers in Los Angeles were recruited from Mississippi, basically because they were racist. They would get themselves ready for patrols in the ghetto by doing racist cheers and things like that.
In the book, you detail all types of riots. Going across the country. Can you outline the different arguments about how the left wanted to deal with it and the right wanted to deal with it? I know some of the left, if you throw money at poverty, that could help it. Right. LBJ, I think, remarked, was frustrated because he kept wanting more money and he saw no results. Nixon, on the other hand, I think there was a quote in the book that said he thought it more effective if you put them all in jail than double the money towards funding poverty. Can you talk about the different arguments about what?
Sure. there was the tragedy of rioting in the 60s was that it did often seem to follow the passage of new civil rights legislation. And this is just an objective fact. The Civil Rights Bill of 1964 passes in July 2nd, you know, and there's a big riot in Harlem the last week of July that spreads to Brooklyn. There's also a riot in Rochester. The Voting Rights Act passes in 1965. 5 days later, the rioting happened in Watts. And what a lot of liberals weren't able to get their mind around was there seemed to be what they call a revolution of rising expectations. Once you take someone who is oppressed and loosen the pressure a little bit, the expectations like explode. And liberals had a lot of confidence at that time in basically the ability to provide social programs to the poor and to alleviate the terrible conditions they were living in, and they were terrible conditions. In a city like East St. Louis, you know, there wasn't even indoor plumbing in a lot of the black neighborhoods. You know, here in Chicago, the housing was so crowded because blacks weren't allowed to live in white neighborhoods that people, you know, you'd have 10 families living in a basement with, you know, like one toilet. You know, I mean, so these were horrific conditions, one we can't even really imagine now. So the liberals were like, improve the conditions. And the conservatives were like, well, we tried that, quote unquote, and people rioted anyway. The irony of it was, one of the things I write about in the book is the Kerner Commission. When Lyndon Johnson appointed this commission to figure out why riots happened. And they very much endorsed the liberal view that we needed to spend basically a Marshall Plan for the cities. And unless we do that, there'll be riots every summer. And we didn't do that, right? I mean, by that time, the Great Society, war and poverty spending had largely kind of dribbled out and, you know, basically drained away into the war in Vietnam. But we didn't have riots after 1969. And the reason turned out to be pretty simple. I mean, it turned out to be pretty easy for police to contain a riot in a certain neighborhood once they figured out the tactics for doing so. Okay. So, I mean, you know, it's one of those things where the conservatives and the liberals, you know, were kind of arguing past each other, and it just turned out to be, well, if you just cordon off the block in a certain way, you can keep a riot from spreading.
You speak of Nixon's, how he was so prone to, for the most part, do whatever was politically expedient. So, as a result, would you say it was even fair to call him a conservative? A lot of people point to the fact that price controls, right, the EPA, look at all different types of things that didn't necessarily make him a conservative.
Right.
What would you rate him on the spectrum from left to right?
Well, that's really the hardest question. It's like solving a quantum physics problem.
Okay.
Right? We don't know what he would have been like had he been able to run his second term the way he wanted to, because by that time, of course, he was fighting full-time to stay out of jail. We do know that his attorney general, who later became his campaign manager, John Mitchell, said in 1970 to a reporter, "This country's going to go so far to the right, you're not even going to recognize it." And, you know, Nixon basically had contempt for the welfare bureaucracy, certainly had contempt for the welfare state, but it was a time in which the center was so much further to the left that we have than it is now. And, you know, presidents can't just kind of snap their fingers and, you know,
wait, you're saying, how are you so sure that the center of that was okay?
The presidents can't snap their fingers and, you know, introduce legislation and expect it to pass. They have to work within the ideological constraints of the time they're working in. Now, it was a lot more left-wing then. Another important part of the equation was Nixon famously didn't care much about domestic politics. He really became president to play the grand chess game of geostrategy, to go to China, to negotiate with Russia, to settle the Vietnam War. And he was pretty much happy to farm out most domestic policy to lower-level aides who basically were following kind of the status quo of the day, which is a lot more liberal. Now, something like price controls, that was just sheer political venality. I mean, 2 weeks before that, he said in a press conference, I don't know if you got this far in the book yet, but that price controls would ruin the economy. So, I mean, he did it, and his approval rating shot through the roof, and exactly what he predicted happened, but by that time he'd already won his re-election. So,